CB Muthamma was the first woman to clear the civil services in India, and she paved the way for generations of future Indian women diplomats. The first woman to enter the newly constituted Indian Foreign Service in 1949. She was also the first woman Indian diplomat and later India's first woman ambassador appointed to the mission in Hungary in 1970. The CB Muthamma Auditorium in Jawaharlal Nehru Bhavan on Janpath in New Delhi, the building that houses the Ministry of External Affairs, is a tribute to her legacy. India has had a strong woman prime minister in Indira Gandhi with an iron hand foreign policy. We have had several women diplomats in important positions, including Chokira Iyer to Nirupama Rao Menon, who served as foreign secretaries. The late Sushma Swaraj, as foreign minister, left her clear imprint with her humane touch to issues related to citizens and Indians overseas. But does India really have a feminist or a gender equal foreign policy? Hi, everyone. You've tuned in to episode 11 of the Foreign Policy podcast Beyond Nation and State on Suno India. I'm your host and independent journalist, Smita Sharma. New episodes drop on the Suno India app, Apple, as well as the Spotify podcasts every Wednesday. And today we will talk about applying the gender inclusive lens to foreign policy in India and the world for gender justice and more sustainable long-term outcomes. Joining me on this episode of Beyond Nation and State is Ambika Vishwanath. She is the co-founder of Cuban Initiative, which is a geopolitical advisory based out of Mumbai. She's also been a young fellow at the Munich Security Conference, works a lot on gender, on climate change, on water issues. And Cuban Initiative, in fact, in 2022, actually published a report which, for those of you who tune into the video segment of this podcast later, you will be able to see. It's called Opportunities for a More Inclusive Indian Foreign Policy. This is also available on their website for you to pursue. Thank you so much, Amika, for joining us here on this podcast.
Thank you. Thank you, Smita.
Let me start by asking you the very basic question and the premise of this report. How do you define a feminist foreign policy?
So that would, I'll have to go back a little bit in time before this report. The feminist foreign policy discussion that started in Europe primarily in 2014 looks at how foreign policy can be better equipped to tackle all the different problems that we are facing over the last several that we have been facing over the last several years in the world, but also that we are likely to face, with an understanding that foreign policy has been very rooted in a certain ethos, in a certain value system, and in a very small group of people, primarily it's been very male oriented. If you look at the trajectory and the history of how countries have conducted foreign policy over the last several decades. And so Sweden was the first country to announce a feminist foreign policy. And from our understanding, their intentions were, of course, to increase representation, because the more women you have in the system, the more different diverse perspectives you have, and that allows you to think about your solutions differently. They may not always be better, and I think this is an important caveat to mention, but they will offer you perspectives that are different. And that becomes really important when you look at solutions. And the other thing was about also how do we strengthen our policies going forward, right? It's not just about numbers. It's also about a longer lasting system that's different, because clearly our systems have not been able to tackle the various problems that we are looking at. We're not well equipped for 2023 or even 2035 going forward. And so that was the background of why a feminist foreign policy conversation began in Sweden. It caught on. Several countries then sort of jumped on that bandwagon, so to speak. But a lot of these countries were and still continue to be rooted in the transatlantic space. So there are countries in Europe, in North America, and now in South America. And so when we started looking at the feminist foreign policy discussion, the one we asked a few questions, but one of the fundamental questions we asked was, how is your foreign policy, and coming out of Europe or coming out of America, how is it going to be different when you are dealing with the rest of the world? Is it actually going to be different? I mean, it's okay for Sweden, which in fact actually doesn't even have a feminist foreign policy anymore as of last year, when the government there changed, but other European countries do. But how are they looking at a different foreign policy when it comes to their relationship with India, when it comes to their relationship with South Asia, when they're
Hmm.
looking at problems in Afghanistan, when they're looking at the Indo-Pacific, Taiwan Strait? I mean, whatever it is it really different in a foreign policy perspective, or is it just different in how you are understanding it within your own country? So that was the questions we began asking. And so several years of research consultations led to this report for two reasons. One is that if a country is going to have a change in foreign policy, it needs to bring in the perspective of its most important partners and its other relationships going forward. Because foreign policy is no longer about what you're doing as a country, it has various ramifications,
Hmm.
whether it's in your own country, whether it's your immediate neighborhood, or whether it's around the globe. And it also needs to understand when you bring your foreign policy to a difficult part of the world, and that difficult part of the world could be because of conflict, could be because of war, but it also could be because the region is facing various climate events, right? So it's very different kind of issues that we are looking at today and going forward. So when you bring your foreign policy over there, what does that actually mean? Is it
Hmm.
better for the region that you're going to be working in? And so
Okay.
we brought out our couple of different reports, and in the course of all of that, we started understanding where India also
Hmm.
sort of positioned itself, and if there was an opportunity for India to have what we didn't term as a feminist foreign policy, but a more inclusive foreign policy, because we went to expand the definition of what we understood as a feminist foreign policy
Is-
would be.
If I may intervene here, Ambika, and I'm going to pick up a lot of, in fact, questions from what you've just said in your opening comments. Uh, you know, when you say that we were using the word gender inclusive. Uh, has there been a generic sort of an obstructionist attitude when you've used the frame of uh, a feminist policy? Is there a sort of a generic skepticism to it and who are the stakeholders for the benefit of the listeners that you actually spoke to for this report?
So this report, I'll answer the second question first, right? This report was part of two reports that we did. One was to decode the global feminist foreign policy conversation for an Indian audience. So in that sense, we spoke to at that time in 2021, we spoke to all the countries at that time that had a feminist foreign policy, or in the case of Canada, they also have a feminist international development trade policy as well, or countries like Germany at that time that were developing their so they made an announcement, but they didn't have it yet. As of 2023, Germany does have a feminist foreign policy, but in 2021 they had made an announcement and they were developing it. So we spoke to all these different countries. We spoke to the government, but we also spoke to the civil society in those countries that were either working with the government or contributing to the research that would ultimately go into it. And then we spoke to feminist organizations. We spoke to organizations working on women, peace, and security, which is the UN SC resolution 1325. We spoke to feminist and women NGOs in India that work with these countries. So we spoke to a very wide range of people to understand how they viewed the discussion of a feminist foreign policy in all of these different countries. And on the parallel, we also spoke to a very large spectrum of what we considered was the Indian foreign policy making ecosystem. So that's your bureaucrats, that's your politicians, that's people within the parliament. We also spoke to media persons, we spoke to think tankers, academics, anyone that might have some sort of connection to your foreign policy making ecosystem within India, which is much broader than we realize very often,
Hmm.
and to what they think a feminist foreign policy for India could look like if we were to have one. And one of the very fundamental things, which then answers your first question, is that the idea that a feminist foreign policy, and here feminism was coming very much from a Western concept. And we realized that how they are defining their feminist foreign policy is makes sense to them. I mean, how Sweden looks at it, how Germany looks at it, how Canada looks at it is very different even from how like Spain looks at it and how Mexico looks at it, right? Because their realities are different. And so how we in India have to look at it also needs to reflect the kind of realities we have in India, because foreign policy is no longer only about foreign policy that's happening somewhere else. It's also very much connected to your domestic policy. And so we expanded a little bit that definition to say an inclusive policy, because it's not just about women. It's not a very binary definition of more women and so everything gets better, but it's a more inclusive way of thinking. So in many cases, how are you looking at your vulnerable communities when you implement your foreign policy? Who is that last mile community that is the most affected by that policy that you have made? Is that community's voice or a perspective from that community, has that been brought in at your planning and implementation stage? And so that's how we define inclusivity when we look at our foreign policy. And I think in terms of a very binary definition of women, men, and gender, India has done quite a bit in the foreign policy space, but we can learn from that and expand that to make it a little bit more inclusive in other aspects as well. And so that's then what led to the second report. And I think that sort of answers your first question, is that there was a little bit of skepticism on the use of the word feminism because it's seen very much as something that's coming from other countries, without a lot of people realizing that the idea of feminism in India is actually quite old. And so we borrowed a little bit from our ancient aspects of how we have seen feminism and modernized it a little bit to say that we don't have to borrow from others. We can learn from our own experiences.
Right. And in fact, Ambika actually mentioned some of the countries that have had this approach, which includes Sweden, which she also, in fact, underlines that since last year has reversed it, or actually it's not there anymore. But there's France, Canada, Mexico, Germany, Spain, Luxembourg, and Libya. I found Libya very interesting, a country which has been torn by civil war for the longest, a country which has been invaded, which has been attacked, which has had war. Um, for Libya, what did a foreign policy approach really sort of achieve? Was it there only on paper? How did you find it?
So, to be honest, the Libya question is something that's baffled a lot of people, including us. This announcement was made by the then foreign minister of Libya. We have seen no movement beyond that, and nothing that we have been able to find, nothing that are. So we work with a very wide network of organizations around the world that are looking at this very question on what a feminist foreign policy means. Do we need to change it? Do we need to expand the definition? How do we bring in a more diverse perspective of voices, even at the this network coordination stage? And nobody has been able to really answer this question of what is happening in Libya. So right now, I suspect a lot of it is just an announcement. It's on paper. There is no movement, but we haven't heard anything in the sense that nothing was rolled back. So that announcement that was made has remained. Maybe it was made for a specific reason. Maybe it was made by a minister that needed to get something else done. It's really been hard to tell what's happening. But as you mentioned, this report is from 2022, and a lot of the research that was done for the report when it was released in April was done in the months before that. There is a lot has changed since 2022 and the summer of 23. And there are other countries that have made this announcement, and there are other countries that have made an intention for a feminist foreign policy. So we're tracking some of those changes as well. And it's good to see that the number of countries has expanded globally. So Mongolia, for example, has also made an announcement for an intention. They don't have, I wouldn't say Mongolia has a feminist foreign policy. What they have, in fact, is more a feminist diplomacy. So they are looking at it more at an outward lens, right? How do we make our diplomacy more gender balanced and more feminist? And I think they will take lessons from that to then perhaps make changes internally, which is what Mexico
Mm.
did as well. They used what they had done on a very pure foreign policy, outward facing space to then make changes within other ministries within Mexico, because they realized that that kind of international attention and pressure could possibly help make changes internally at their domestic level. And I think Mongolia is going to go down that path as well. And so, in that sense, Mongolia might be the first Asian country
Mm.
to sort of embark on this path.
But coming to the subject of foreign policy itself, of course, this is a wide basket. While it is about diplomacy, about international relations, there is also, as you said, the wider ramifications on the domestic fronts, from climate to economy, and of course, the larger question of national security itself. So, having said that, perhaps many would argue that foreign policy should be a gender neutral subject. Where do you weigh in on that? And if it's not gender neutral, do you actually think that more women coming into the system will perhaps add a more humane perspective to it?
That's a hard question, Smita.
Not a soft one.
No, no, no. See, I don't think foreign policy can truly be gender neutral, even if we want it to be. Realistically, whatever decision is made rests with a person or a group of people that is making a decision. They are making a decision based on information they have. Information is collected again by another group of people, right? It now might be collected by AI and various forms of technology, but that is also created by people. And people, at the end of the day, as much as we'd like to believe that we are, you know, nuanced and unbiased, we are not. We are human beings, right? So there is a certain amount of bias, there is a certain amount of your own socialization, your own thinking that comes into it. And sure, diplomats might be very different when it comes to being able to exercise what they have learned and how their training has been. Not everybody in the foreign policy making system is a diplomat. A lot of people are bureaucrats. A lot of people come from a very wide range of backgrounds, within, I mean, even if you take India. And so a lot of that thinking is going to play into where your information is coming from. What is the information you have gathered? What is the information you choose to pass on to the person who's going to make a decision, right? How do we ensure that that bias is balanced? I don't think we can, ultimately, I don't think we can remove it completely. It is at the, I have it, you have it, we all have it. We try not to have it, right? And so the best way to try and minimize that, I would say, is to have, when you are making it, when you're gathering information, when you're using that information, when you are making a decision based on that information, do you have a number of people who are bringing in a variety of perspectives to ensure then that that one decision that is made, that one solution that is implemented, heard everything that is possible, and then made the best possible solution over there. And the only way you're
Mm.
going to do that is by ensuring then that your room that you're talking to, or the information that came from, is as wide ranging as possible. And the only way to do that is to have, along with all the men who are already in the system, you have women, but you also need to have a diversity of, so it's not just about, like, all the men and women coming from a certain city or a certain background in India. You need to have them coming from various cities across India. They need to be coming from a
Mm.
diverse background, because people who are coming from a background living in border states in India have a very different idea of what security means than from people who are lived in a city centrally somewhere in India, who have perhaps never faced a border security question in their life, right?
Mm.
So that in itself is a diversity of perspective. They bring in a different thinking. And that
Mm.
is why then we took feminism to say more inclusive in for an Indian perspective, because that is only when your foreign policy, your security policy is truly going to be the best it can
Mm.
be, because you've heard all the different opinions, thoughts, voices, and then you've made a decision. And so
I'm just going to expand on the question a little bit because I'm sure that this is a question that many people would, think about every time you talk about a more gender inclusive or a feminist foreign policy. You've had several commendable women leaders, strong women leaders. We've had an Angela Merkel to a Jacinda Ardern. In India, we've had an Indira Gandhi who left her, of course, absolutely difference and a very strong stamp on foreign policy. And then you've also had, of course, the male leaders for whom foreign policy has been a legacy issue, including Prime Minister Narendra Modi right now. So a lot of these foreign policy, in fact, directives have actually been muscular in their approach. When you need to go to a war, you go to a war. You're not thinking about the humanitarian crisis that is going to unfold. So whether it's a male leader or a female leader, these hard decisions will be taken. If you don't, then perhaps the woman leader would be judged even more harshly. So in that context, when you have more women leaders, women voices into the system, as an expert, what is it that you would want to see being done differently on foreign policy? Which are the subjects where you think that perhaps more inclusivity can lead to a more different, a more nuanced, or a more sensitive approach?
everything. There is no picking over here as to what we can make better and what we don't make better. I personally don't believe that more women means you will have a more humane approach. It's not. I think history tells you otherwise. There have been enough women who have had a very sort of hard stance when it comes to their foreign and security policy, their leadership in their countries. And there is the odd male leader, especially in the last couple of decades, that have possibly you will term as taken a more soft stance on certain issues, right? And these are, but I don't think it's about um, it's a very, I don't think you can have a very like black and white definition over here. As you said rightly, when there is war, there is war. You have to take hard decisions. And the current German foreign minister has very clearly said, when it comes to Germany's foreign policy and their feminist foreign policy, it is not, a feminist foreign policy here is not a magic wand. It's not that, because she's a woman foreign minister and she's surrounding herself by more women voices within her system, it's going to make everything better. Uh, it's about the fact that when you consider, leaving war aside, right? When you are in a state of like um in a non-war state, I guess, what is it that your foreign policy is doing for your country?
Ambika, sorry, there's suddenly a lot of noise.
Outside. Yeah, sorry, that's outside construction. I cannot do anything about. Is it?
Yeah,
If it starts again, I will stop speaking.
yeah.
Yeah. So, foreign policy is about what is it that you are doing for your country and for the countries that you are working in and working with, right? And in that sense, are you looking at foreign policy only as a means of security, which is used to be the case? Or are you looking at foreign policy as a means of integrating it with your trade, with your development, with your economy, with your soft power, with your education, with your climate policies? And today, all of this is integrated. You cannot anymore say that my climate policy that I'm implementing in the Pacific Islands, the fact that India is now working to bring better water development in your Pacific Islands, in Tuvalu, for example, or education, all of that is also part of your foreign policy, right? And so, at that stage, is there, are you looking at a wider lens of how I'm going to plan for things that are going to happen in the Pacific Islands or in parts of Africa or in Southeast Asia? and who is there in that room when I'm looking at that wider lens, right? And so it comes down to that. It's not like, oh, foreign policy is only about my neighborhood, it's only about
Hmm.
Pakistan, and it's only about China. It's about all of these things as well. And I think at the end of the day, when you are in that system, you've done your training, you're at that high position, whether you're a man or a woman, if a hard decision needs to be taken, if a really difficult decision needs to be taken, the person over there is going to be taking it. But that's not the case in every situation. You're also taking decisions about what I need to do in other parts of the world. And so, and when I take those decisions, am I also looking at a much more humane approach? And I, again, to your previous question, I don't think it's necessary only that women will take a humane approach. And
Hmm.
so the one thing that we talk about in this report and that we constantly are stressing upon is that it's not about the person, but about the office. When that person says, when India is partnering with X country and we are going to work together on environment, it should be about the office and not the person, right? At the end of the day, if your office and the system around that says that when you are implementing your foreign policy on various aspects, does it ensure that the last mile, as I said, that community or the country that you're working with, are they also getting the best out of your foreign policy, and are you
Hmm.
also getting the best out of your foreign policy? And you've created a system to ensure that that works. It doesn't matter if there is a man or a woman holding that position, right? Because that's going to continuously change. But the only way you can ensure that that system changes if you've had already a diverse set of perspectives that have created or contributed to the creation of that system. So you have to start with a diversity of perspectives to ultimately reach a place where gender then doesn't matter.
Okay, then let me just shift the context to the Indian scenario, and just put in the last couple of questions. And I'm quoting these numbers from a recent article which was penned by the former Foreign Secretary Nirupama Rao Menon, of course, who has held a lot of important positions during her diplomatic career. And she actually wrote this article about CB Muthamma, who I mentioned in the introduction to my podcast. She cites the numbers that of the 1115 foreign officers in service in India, there are 253 women officers, including 10 women ambassadors and 4 women high commissioners. How do you find distressing the sort of gap in the heads of divisions, heads of missions, or the number of women diplomats in the Ministry of External Affairs in India?
I mean, if you look at it as of today, sure, it is distressing. But I I think we have to also understand that the reason it is so low at that highest level is because 30 years ago the number of women entrants into the service was very low. Over the last 3 decades, those numbers have continuously improved and increased. Every year, we see more and more women are entering the foreign service. So, definitely in the next 10 to 15 years, you're going to see those numbers change. And I mean, as much as I'd like to be like, have 50% parity or more women in all your ambassadorial positions, it's not realistic. You have to go through the system. Sure, in the 80s, could we have had more women enter the system so that today we have more women ambassadors? Yes, but that's a ship that's sailed. Can we ensure that that is not something that is perpetuated in the future? I think yes. And both the foreign minister has repeatedly said, and the Sushma Swaraj Institute have also repeatedly said that they are now trying to ensure that every single batch that is coming in, and as of August 1st, 2023, we have a new batch of officers under training, and there is again almost 40% of them are women. We haven't, I want to say with the caveat that that list has not yet been released at the time of we are recording this podcast. So I'm
Hmm.
only going by the fact that I've seen photographs of the men and the women officers right now. So I'm basically counting these photographs. So it's around, looks at like it's around 40%, and it's been consistently that for the last several years, right? So we are seeing change. We so I think it's, yes, I agree that it's not ideal, but it will change, and I have no doubt about that, because There is no way now for India, the way it is around the world, the kind of power that it's becoming, the kind of country that people are looking India at, the way we are viewing India, the kind of questions India is getting, whether we want to answer them or not globally,
Hmm.
we are still internalizing them, right? And you cannot say women led development at the G20 level. You cannot go to the UN and argue for certain things without making some of these changes at home. And these are not difficult changes to make. And so
Hmm.
I do think in the next 10 years, and we hope to be every 2 years, we want to update our report with updated numbers. And I think in the next decade, you will see that there is more, definitely a much better balance. The
Hmm.
other thing I do want to say is that yes, we have very few women ambassadors, but some of the posts, and a lot of them have changed now again at the end of July, early August 2023. But as of last year, a lot of the very important posts to India were occupied by women. So I think that in itself is a message, right? If you can only have like 10 or 12 women ambassadors because those are the women who've gone through the training, they have the capacity to be an ambassador. Where are you going to put them? And the decision to put them in countries that are really important partners for India, I think is also a message. So I think we
Yeah.
should look at it from both sides.
So, Ambika, then, but it also brings me to my next question: that does larger representation effectively also mean meaningful participation? And we've seen this in the Indian newsrooms a lot. When in the initial years, and I've spent 20 years in the newsrooms, a lot of women would be, of course, recruited and hired, but they would be allocated what in those days used to be called the soft beats of not doing politics. Of course, the pandemic changed the perception that health, climate are actually not soft beats. They are the everyday beats that impact your daily lives the most, and they are such important beats. So today, of course, we are in a position where a lot of the Indian newsrooms have foreign policy editors who are women, and I must say that who are doing a spectacular and a fantastic job of asking the right questions. Uh, so when it comes to the Indian foreign policy making, because that one image that stays with me is post Uri strikes in the Cabinet Committee on Security, when you saw the foreign minister, Sushma Swaraj, actually missing from the room. So, when it comes to decision making processes, do you think that you still have an approach in India where perhaps the women diplomats are being allocated what could be seen as, you go deal with diaspora, you go deal with maybe the softer issues, and not really come into the hard decision making?
Sure, I would agree a little bit that I think that that's still the case, and that's not just the case with foreign policy. It's the case with everything in India. I think it's the case with everything globally still, right? We are now seeing a world that is very visibly changing from a system that was fairly male entrenched and patriarchal for several decades, right? And there is a kind of pushback, and yeah, the kind of pushback you're seeing in India versus the kind of pushback you're seeing in Europe or in the US or in Australia, it's different, but there is pushback. uh, is it enough? I think that's debatable, but it's there. And so, whatever the space is, I work a lot on water and climate. I have been working on water for almost 20 years now, right? From going in the field to doing field work, where I have been for years in the field looking at how women are affected by water insecurity, by conflict, water related conflict in parts of the Middle East, in parts of Africa, parts of India. And I have been the only woman for in any setting, right? Now it's different. But to say that women, because there are more of them, they all have this agency and this ability, I don't think so. And I don't think that will change overnight either. You and I, Smita, are very different kinds of people. We're very like, I would say we're very different in terms of how we put ourselves out there also, right? Sure, we've gone through our own problems in life, but not all people are like that. So it's to say to that gender parity in the foreign service, 40% women, do they all have that agency? Perhaps not. Will they all learn to have that agency? Yes. And I think that's the case when it comes to the media also, or when it comes to the think tanking space in India. I mean, look at the think tank space in India, right? There are some amazing women intellectuals, women think tankers. But if you look at the number of think tanks in India, there are very few women headed organizations. The
Mm.
top leadership, the top level is still very male dominated. But if you look at the next rung and the middle rung, there's a lot more women now who are in this space. And so ultimately that will also change. But it doesn't always mean that they have agency. And I think that's not the case also only with women, right? A lot of young men who are coming and joining the foreign service, joining the think tank space, they're coming from all kinds of background in India. They also need a little bit of agency. And I think once that is easier to attain, then you will see more pushback, right? There is a very interesting story, and I shouldn't and I can't name the ambassador, but it's a very well known Indian ambassador couple, both retired now, but they're pretty prominent in the Indian government space.
Mm.
And the wife, she had training in a language and wanted to be posted to that country, but the service posted her husband instead because man and all of that. Now she pushed back as much as she could, right? And this is the 70s, we're talking about the 70s and the 80s, and it took her years of pushback to be able to make change happen, and then make change happen for the next people that came after her. And
Mm.
she should have been posted to that country because she spoke that language fluently. Her husband didn't. Ultimately, then the husband also said, this is not the right thing to do. But you need both the women to be able to say, I this is not right, but
Mm.
also ensure that that doesn't happen for the next generation. A lot of times, women and men, we get to a certain position and we perpetuate that cycle. We shouldn't be perpetuating that cycle. And then you need the men also to say, okay, this is not right. I'm not going to take this posting. This other person is better suited for the job. That's
Mm.
hard to do, but it's necessary also.
Yes, I think that is a very important part where, it just cannot be left to the women to ensure that they get their due, not just in foreign policy, but anywhere. So just one final question then, Ambika. Today we see what is happening in Afghanistan and the horrible atrocities that women and children are going through on a daily basis. Uh, for the superpower of the world, the Americans, how do you see their foreign policy as? And not just about a feminist approach, but also about the other genders, the LGBTQI. Uh, do you think that the countries that are adopting these approaches, that there is a distinct shift in their language and their narratives?
I don't know if I would still consider America a superpower any longer. Having lived there at a time when the country changed, I was there when 9/11 happened, and before 9/11, and then during and after, and you saw that shift. Um, sure, it is the economic powerhouse that it is, but I think it's time the world stopped looking at America as the only option of how things can work. Um, and that in itself also is a very different inclusive approach, right? Are we only looking at one or two countries to tell us how things can or should be done? The global system itself needs to be much more feminist and inclusive in that sense. I think if we had had a better variety of perspectives and national country voices when it came to how to deal with Afghanistan, there is probably a good chance we would the Afghanistan and then the world wouldn't be in the position it is today. And this is also coming down to a different kind of inclusivity when it comes to our global governance systems and our decision making systems. I do think that while countries that have a feminist foreign policy, even Sweden that has rescinded it post its elections, while it doesn't say publicly feminist foreign policy, a lot of the work that they are doing has not changed. And I think that's important. So their language, their programs, they all remain the same. It's just that the government has said, we're not going to say feminist foreign policy, but we're actually going to do the work that our previous government set out to do. I think while their feminist foreign policy might be coming from various different perspectives. Canada's looking at it differently. Australia's got a First Nations foreign policy, which is really important for them given their indigenous community. The fact that they are bringing a different language, a different narrative, and they're bringing all of that to the global governance conversations, those changes become really important. And then even India, we don't have a feminist foreign policy or an inclusive foreign policy, but we do have a lot of gender mainstreaming when it comes to our foreign policy, things that no other country has done, that other countries are doing now, that we've been doing for the last 30 years. And I think bringing some of those ideas to those systems then makes for better global foreign policy and international relations and geopolitics. And so I think, yeah, going forward, I would hope that this makes our global governance better. But we have to allow for all of this to grow as well, right? We cannot say, oh, you've had this for 3 years now and nothing has changed. You've had a system for 70 years and nothing has changed, right? Why are we expecting that in 3 or 4 or 5 years, things are going to get better because, there are 7 more women leaders?
As I end the conversation, Ambika, who have been the personal inspiration for you to study feminism, to study women-related issues so closely?
I think at a personal level, I would say my grandmothers, both who were diplomat wives, were huge inspirations because they were not just women who sat at home and of course they threw the parties that their husbands needed, because that's what they did back then. But my one grandmother, everywhere she was posted, she started schools. My other grandmother used to teach. So in that sense, they were huge inspirations for me personally, and also my mother. But on a I think there are some women I've met over the years. My first boss ever, Sriparna, she's been a huge inspiration in my life. There is a woman in the US, Lyric Thompson, who runs the Feminist Foreign Policy Collective now, that we are a member of as well. She inspires me every day. And yeah, so these are people. I wouldn't name world leaders because, as they say,
Does this
never.
women's collective have a website or something?
Yes, the Feminist Foreign Policy Collective.
Okay, that's
Yeah.
that's interesting to know. But thank you so much, Ambika. This
Thank
was
you.
lovely to have a conversation around, and I think it's an important subject. The more we talk about it, it still doesn't suffice. We need to talk about it a lot. And for those who are listening in, you can engage with Ambika on Twitter. Her Twitter handle is The Idle Thinker. So thank you so much, Ambika Vishwanath.
Thank you, Smita.